Next up, I'd like to revisit this colored circles little demo app we put together, where you can click a button and generate a random circle, or the circle itself is positioned randomly. So let's make a bunch of turquoise and one light steel blue, one peach puff, and I can click on a specific circle and it moves somewhere else. Okay, so the way that we wrote this was to have, well, we had a bunch of components, but on the circle side of things, we had our circles. I think it was a colored circles component. I actually have it here. I've added in all those components and all the CSS into a folder. And I did this because I'm actually going to make a second version, and it's going to be easier if I just have another folder called colored circles 2 instead of having all of these files in source and then having to rename or create duplicates called circle2.js, circle2 or colored buttons2.js. I didn't want to do that, so I'm going to have two folders. The only thing I have to pay attention to are the paths that I'm importing from. So in the folder itself, I can still use // if all of the relevant CSS and JavaScript files are in this folder. But then in app, when I'm actually importing the component, I need to reference the correct path, colored circles 1/colored circles. /colored circles 1. Okay, so I'm rendering single colored circles, and if we look at that, just to jog your memory here, we have a piece of state called circles. It's an array, and that array is going to hold objects. Each object represents a circle. It has a color, it has an X, and it has a Y coordinate. So when I click a button, up here, we are generating a new circle. We're adding it into that state. That causes a re-render. So we're definitely going to need state in that parent. We have these buttons where we're adding in new elements, new circles, so we need to have some place to add them into. However, when we added in this position, this change in position where I click a single button, we have a bit more flexibility in how we structure things. So I'm going to show you another option and talk about the limitations of this option, the benefits and the limitations. Right now, all of the state is up in this colored circles component. The circle itself is stateless. All that it does is display at a random position that are passed in. X and Y are passed as props, and then it has a nice CSS class, and there's an onClick that calls a function passed down from the parent that calls change position for this one circle, and when we change position, we're mapping over all the circles and finding the correct one, updating its X and Y to have random numbers, and that causes a re-render. So then we see all the other circles rendered in the same place as before, but the one that we just clicked will be moved, assuming that those random numbers are different. I guess theoretically it's possible that they could be exactly the same, highly unlikely. So another option here would be to have some state in a circle component. If we think about it, does our parent component, does the colored circles component, that array, does it need to know the position? Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe it makes the most sense to store that state in the individual circle, and I can just click on the circle, it will move. It's still part of that parent component, the circle itself, the color, all of that, but maybe I store the coordinates in state on an individual circle. So I'm going to show this to you. I'm not officially endorsing this, by the way. We'll talk about why you would do one versus the other. But just as we explore how we can use state, I want to try doing this. So I'm going to duplicate this entire folder. Is there a duplicate here? No? All right, well, I'm just going to paste it then. Okay, and I'm going to rename it to be colored circles 2. And then I can leave all these files the same because now they're in a separate folder. And now in my app, I can just import from colored circles 2 instead. And it should still work. Okay, good. Now let's go to our colored circles component. So we have that component and then the circle component itself. So one option, as I've already mentioned, would be to keep the state for the position in the circle itself. If I wanted to do that, I would need to make sure to import, use state, and then inside of this circle, I could generate a piece of state. I could have X and Y be separate, but I would probably just make a piece of state called position, and then set position equals use state, and then I would need to pass in my initial state, which would be an object. It would have X set to something, and then Y set to something. And I think what I would do is take this random function we've generated, getRandom, and move that over here. Just put that up top. and then we could call getRandom, and y will be getRandom as well. So the way that this setup is going to work is that we won't be passing in a prop, x and y, anymore. We don't need that. We don't need to generate the random in our circles. We can just keep a color up here if we wanted to. So I'm just going to stop passing x and y. For now, it's still defined in this component, but I'm not going to pass it down. Then in this component, on the very first render, we're going to pick a random x, a random y, and store that in a variable called position. It's part of the state. I'll need to update this to be position.y, position.x. And then over here, in my colored circles component, I'm going to get rid of this change position. Just delete that entirely. And I'm not going to call getRandom anymore. I'm just going to generate a color here. And I don't even know if I want an object anymore. I think I might just put that color in there when we add a circle. So we're back to just storing the colors in our circles. So it'll be like blue and green, although those aren't the color names we're using at the moment. And then the position will all be stored in the child. So then here we don't have anything to destructure anymore. It's just the color. We don't need that object. We don't need change position. We'll pass in color, index. That's all good. And then in our circle, we don't need change position. And we're going to just remove that on click for now. Okay. So now I should be able to click, and I still get a randomly positioned circle. And if we open up our DevTools, I still need a key for those buttons. Should probably take care of that, but that's not what I want to talk about at the moment. If we look at the state for colored circles, it's just a bunch of colors. If we look at the state for a single actual circle, it has two pieces, x and y. So it has a prop for the color, as well as the index it's passed in. It uses that to display 1 or 6. And then it actually generates its own random number, or two random numbers, x and y, and puts that in state. Now if I wanted to update one of my circles, when you click, I could define a function to call. We'll call this const, gen coordinates, move circle. Sure. And move circle doesn't even need to accept an index or anything, because it only is going to run on a particular circle. It already knows what circle we're updating. We don't need to reference it. We're not updating an array anywhere. We're just going to call set position. So in here, we'll just call set position. And then we don't really need to update based off of the previous position. So we'll just make a new object where x is getRandom and y is getRandom. And then we can add our onClick. And when you call that, or when you click, we will call moveCircle. Okay, let's see if it works. I'll make a couple, and then one peach puff. I click peach puff, and it is indeed moving. So we now have replicated the exact same functionality as before, but we've set it up in a different way. Now let's compare the two. First of all, with this approach, this newer version, which I'm not showing you second because I think it's better. I'm showing it to you just so we can discuss them. Just want to get that out there. With this newer version here, we have state definitely more spread out. Now that generally can be a bad thing, depending on what you need and what your use cases are. But having state splintered across different circle components, having some state pertaining to all the circles as an array up here, we're storing the colors, but then down here we store the position on each circle. That can be great if you never need all of that data together. If we ever needed to have access to all of the circle data, I want the positions and the color for every circle, I want it in an array, I'm kind of out of luck. I can't just go from here and ask for the x and y coordinate of each circle I'm rendering. React just doesn't work that way. I can't do that. I can pass data down, but I can't pass data back up unless I have a function or something that we're calling. So the data is spread out. And a lot of the times in more complicated apps, more realistic apps where we do have a backend, we'll actually be loading data from an API somewhere. And we might be getting an array of circles coming in JSON where we have the color, we have X, and we have Y, where we'd actually have values, not just the property names, for every circle. And it's a lot easier if we have our state consolidated for all circles in a single component then I can just make that API call, get my data, and just use it. Put that in the state. With the way I've set things up now, the state is splintered, and that is less common to see. Although it is not a bad thing in itself, you'll just often see applications where state is consolidated, it's been lifted up to the highest component that needs access to it. So that doesn't mean taking all of your state for an entire application and putting it in one component, although we'll talk about sort of a similar strategy later on. What I mean more is if we have 20 components or 100 components, and 5 of them are kind of working in cooperation for this circles portion of our application. If we have state that pertains to circles, it might be best to move it into the highest level circle component, the highest component that needs to know about it, but not at the top of your app component. You're not going to put all your state all the way at the very top. We want to keep it as close to the components that need it as possible, but also high enough up that all components have access to it, because we can pass state down as props. So here, with the second approach that we took, where we split things up, there is an advantage. One, it's easier to update the state, right? I don't have to worry about arrays and not mutating an array and all of that stuff, which is kind of obnoxious when you're starting out with React. It seems a little bit tricky, but there's actually another advantage as far as how these components are rendered. So why don't we take a look at our DevTools right now. This is our new version that we wrote. I'm going to go to components. I think I turned this off. I'm going to highlight updates when a component renders. So we'll get a little block. We've already seen this before. But when a component re-renders, we can see that there's these boxes highlighting. That shows us that a component has been rendered. So all these components are being re-rendered. Now, why are they all being re-rendered when I add a single circle in? What's happening there is that the state for the parent component, colored circles, is changing. And whenever the state changes, when set circles finishes running, React re-renders the entire component. So all of this is re-rendered. Color buttons is re-rendered. All of the circles are mapped over, and circle for each one is re-rendered. So if we have 20 circles on the page, adding a single circle in still causes React to re-render using that entire array of circles. It puts all the ones that have already been there in the same spot. Nothing looks like it's changing, but then it adds in this new circle. So you can see they're all updating. And that's pretty common in React. This is the React-y way we're doing things. There are ways of preventing those unnecessary re-renders, right? We don't need to re-render any of these except for the new thing that we're adding in, which is not really a re-render, it's an initial render. So if I have a bunch of pale turquoise ones, none of those need to re-render just because I'm adding in Peach Puff. But they will. And that's not any different from the original version that we wrote. However, what is different is when I move one of them, that component that I click on is the only thing to re-render, because the only state that is being impacted is this one circle state. We keep that state in the circle. So that is an advantage. With the original approach we took, where the state is more consolidated into a single array, every circle has a color, an X, and a Y, and they're stored in that same array all together. When I update a single circle, that's changing the state for that parent component, which means all of these are going to be re-rendered, just like when I add a circle in. Now again, there are ways around that. We haven't gotten to it yet. There are ways to tell React, don't re-render this unless I actually changed, if my data changed. Don't re-render this circle. But we're not doing that at the moment. So if we go back to my app and I swap this out for colored circles 1/colored circles, this is the original version where all of the state is kept in the parent. If we look at colored circles, I add a circle in. The state contains color X and Y for every circle. So no state on the child component. That makes it easier in some ways. Our state is more centralized. But now when I move a single circle, every single component on here, well, at least everything that's being rendered inside of colored circles, updates, which is not ideal. But we'll see how to fix that later on, so don't get too hung up on that. It is an important distinction, but there are ways around it. So this is probably giving you zero clarity, right? I'm not telling you which way is better because it's not clear. It really depends on what you're doing with your application. So if this was our entire app, this was all we needed, then I would say the refactored or the second version where we actually broke state up, I would say that might be better because we don't need that state on the parent. We don't need the position on the parent. But on a lot of the apps that we write in the real world, this approach that I'm showing you now, where we have one array or one piece of state that is responsible for a bunch of child components, that is far more commonly used. It's a pattern that is more frequent to see, and it lends itself better to loading data from an external API or saving data to an API. If we ever needed to have information about all the circles in one place, then breaking the state up and putting some in the circle component, some in the colored circles parent is not going to help us. So to show you an example of what I mean, what if I wanted a button here that would move every single circle? I could click it and just screw everything up. They would all move across the screen. Well, if I have all of the position and all of that information available in my colored circles 1, let me just make sure I'm looking at the right one. This is very confusing for you, probably. Colored circles 1, the original, where we have all of the state data stored in the parent. There is nothing in our circle component here. It's stateless. In this version, I could just add a button in. Let's do it probably there. Button randomize all. And then I would just call with an on click some function that doesn't exist yet, randomize. Now I can define randomize, const randomize, and I have access to the state, all the state that I need. I need every X and every Y. I want to update them or change them, and I can do that pretty simply in here. I would call set circles, and then we'll be passed in the parameter of circles, and then we'll map over that. So circles, need just no space there. Let's update that. Circles.map. And for every circle, we're basically going to return, let's probably break this up into a couple lines, but for every C, we want an object where we have the circle color in there, but X is a new random, and Y is a new random. So that's all we need to do. We map over all the current circles, we keep the same color, and then this is technically going to keep everything the same if there was other data in there, and then we overwrite or we update X and Y to be new randoms, and that's going to cause a re-render. So every element in that state, every object in there will have a new X and a new Y. We'll map over them again down here, and they'll each be re-rendered past new props. So let's try it. Make a couple of them, randomize all. They're all being moved. They all are being re-rendered with new props. That state is changing from the parent. Now, if I tried to do this with the other approach, this second approach that we talked about where we broke the state up, it's not really going to work out for me. So I would need a button somewhere. I wouldn't put a button inside of each circle component where that position state is. I would put the button in the parent, so colored circles. And then if I had a method that I called or a function called randomize when you clicked it, how could I randomize every single button's or every single circle's X and Y? How could I do that? I don't have a way of forcing circle to make a new X and Y. The way that each X and Y is generated from circle is a function, move circle. I can't call that function from a parent. I have no access to that. I have no access to the state and the child component. So all of a sudden, here is a relatively simple feature. It's obviously not a very important feature, but neither is clicking to make colored buttons or colored circles. But all of a sudden, what seemed like it was a great approach maybe is not going to work out for us if we really want this randomize all. We need the state to be somewhat centralized. We need it to be lifted up high enough so that the top level component that needs to care about it has access to it. So in this case, the highest level component that needs to know about these circles and all the states is colored circles. So we can have a button in here that knows about the state. We have circles that can be passed that state and can call functions that will be defined in the parent and update the state, but the state itself is centralized here. Now, if we didn't need this, if we didn't need to randomize things, we didn't need access to all of the data at once, then maybe it would be a good approach to split the state up. But now imagine an application where instead of randomizing everything, What if you had a list of to-dos and we needed to reorder them, sort them, filter them by which ones are completed, which ones are not completed? What about just deleting a single to-do? How would that work if we kept all that to-do state on the to-do itself? We would need to keep that state on the parent, the list of to-dos, the container. Same idea with these circles. This is just a somewhat simpler explanation. All right. So if you're still with me, I know this has been a lot, and there really hasn't been any definite answer. Just know that you're not alone if you're struggling to figure out what needs to go in state and where to put that state. There's a pretty good tutorial on the React docs that talks about state and lifting state up, and it goes into a pretty good amount of detail, especially this section, lifting state up. And I do like how they sum it up at the end. There should be a single source of truth for any data that changes in a React application. Usually the state is first added to the component that needs it for rendering. Then, if other components also need it, you can lift it up to their closest common ancestor. So if we had approached the circles thing the other way around, we might have started by defining the state for each circle in the circle component itself. But then if we realized, oh, we actually need access to be able to make new circles or randomize all of them, we would pull that state up to the parent, which is exactly what we started with, but that process is kind of what they're describing here. They also talk about that any state that lives in some component will live only in that one component. It's centralized, it's in one component. That makes it much easier to debug. There are fewer places for things to go wrong, versus with this other approach we saw, we had some state in circle, some state in colored circles. Things could get out of sync or confused or just buggy pretty easily. Okay. Take a break if you're still there. This has been a lot. I'll see you next. We're going to talk about forms in React.